Kia ora and welcome to this evening's Canterbury Bowling Initiatives presentation. My name's Kieran Ambler. I'm the Development Manager at Christchurch Metro Cricket, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here for this great opportunity to hear from New Zealand, but not only New Zealand, leading world experts in this area. Just firstly, I'd like to thank Mike Johnson and St Andrews for hosting us here tonight in this wonderful building. We've also got some students here recording, which is awesome as well, and that'll be available for you all after the presentation. I'd also like to thank each and every one of you for attending tonight as well. We've got a great panel of experts here, but it also takes your openness and eagerness to learn to ensure that we make the most out of these types of evenings. So thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenters tonight. The first needs little introduction. Former black cap, he is known for his express pace and love of knocking over the Aussies. He now coaches all around the world in various T20 franchises, as well as doing some stints with the Black Caps. Shane Bond, thank you. Our next presenter is Dr. Rob Campbell, who's a specialist sports physician for over 30 years and has worked with New Zealand cricket as their doctor for 10 years. I would say that anybody that's had a back-related injury in cricket has spent a bit of time with Rob. Welcome. Next, we have strength and conditioning expert Greg King. Greg has led strength and conditioning programs in South Africa and India for their national associations, and currently is the strength and conditioning coach for Chennai Super Kings and Canterbury Cricket. He is also in the process of completing his PhD relating to fast bowling. We're also lucky enough to have Rowan Shuton here, a world-leading orthopaedic surgeon and the go-to man for any fast bowler needing surgery. So, thank you, welcome. And last but not least, Amos Johnson. Amos has worked for Physio South since 2008, and he was the Canterbury Cricket's physio for 7 years. Amos has also worked for High Performance Sport New Zealand. With Amos's history with back injuries, he is one of the go-to physios in New Zealand. Amos is the key driving force behind this group, and I'd like to welcome him to start off proceedings.
When he says that, it's actually Kieran who gets these things organised, so I just want to thank Kieran for the opportunity to come and talk to you all today. So this all started about 5 years ago. I was in my offices in winter time after cricket season, and a young man walked into my office, and he was a really good cricketer, under 15s Canterbury rep, also probably like best bowler in his school, best bowler in his club, and he had just come off 3 games in 3 days, and on the 3rd day he had developed back pain. And this was a really familiar story. I'd probably seen about 5 of them already that winter. And unfortunately, it turned out that he had a stress injury, and he had a reasonable stress fracture going on. So a little after this, I was talking to Shane, and Shane was a mutual friend of the family, and we come to the conclusion that more needed to be done about this area, and more needed to be done to improve the knowledge of these injuries in our young bowlers. So back in 2020, we did a presentation, and all of the people that actually attended that have probably moved on now, and so we're on to a second version of it. So thanks for attending. So thank you for all of your questions that you've sent in, and we're going to try and cover most of them today, and most of them are related to technique, loading and injury prevention. But if there is any specific questions that you want to ask the presenters, there's a little bit of time at the end of each section to pop your hand up, and we'll take a mic round, and then you can ask whatever you need to. So this is what tonight's going to look like. First of all, we're going to have a special guest come up, and we're going to do a little Q&A with him. Then we're going to talk about like the risks and challenges with stress fractures. Rob's going to come up, and we're going to talk a bit about the medical side of things. And then Shane and Greg are going to come up and talk about bowling technique and loading. And then following that, I'm going to go back into some injury pathways and how we manage these. And then once it's all done, if you've still got any other questions or you want to come up and have a chat to our presenters, we will do that as well. So I'd now like to bring up Canterbury fast bowler Ed Nuttall. So Ed is actually a big reason why I was so interested in stress fractures. He was probably one of the toughest ones that I went through in my career at Canterbury Cricket. And I was just hoping Ed could share his experiences with us. So Ed, do you want to take us back to when you got your stress fracture?
Yeah, ironically it probably started off because of another injury. It was so I had the injury mid-season, and then the back end of the season with 4-day cricket. And I guess I was pretty hungry to kind of get back in and playing straight or as quick as I could. So I probably didn't quite go through a gradual loading process that I should have done. So I sort of was trying to prepare for a 4-day, and I tried cramming a bit of bowling leading into it. And I sort of remember being in a bit of pain.
Well, it was a pretty important 4-day as well though, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, we needed to win the next two to try and wrap up the title. And I guess like you probably all get told, like pace bowling, fast bowling, it does hurt. It's just trying to distinguish what's a healthy pain, if that's such a thing, or what's actually something you need to monitor and then stop.
Yeah.
So naturally that was in my head. Look, bowling hurts, just keep going through it, just keep bowling through it, especially being a younger guy with older guys in the team that you just don't want to say no to. And so yeah, with bowling through the game, so this is the first 4-day, it was just, pace was down, every ball was just like wind knocked out here, just agony, be just saying, but it was just on the threshold of, no, I can get through this and tomorrow it'll be okay, or I'll do this stretch and I'll loosen up. And then I think we had 7 days off for the next one. I've been thinking, right, I'm doing no bowling because I just need any rest I can get. Again, trying to win the last one. Adrenaline helped me a little bit, and then it got to the second innings, and I remember just being like, I couldn't bowl. I remember being at mid-off, and I couldn't even like bend over to like say tie your shoelace. I was thinking, geez, if a ball comes there, I'm literally just going to flop.
Yeah.
And I think you gave me a rub down afterwards, and I tried to get from physio bed, and it just like froze. It was just
I think that was when stuck in there, weren't you?
Yeah. But if that had, I don't know, if I had probably let go of my ego or thought my pride and just gone, this bowling sucks, it shouldn't hurt this much, it should be fun, probably would have avoided it. It might have been a stress reaction as opposed to a full stress fracture.
I think one thing we did find with that particular injury that there was a heck of a lot of, there wasn't just a stress fracture, but there was also a lot of blood going on in your muscles and things as well. So it was, you'd actually kind of taken it, quite far along. So you were talking about your injury just prior to that. So I remember you did your AC joint, didn't you? And so that was kind of mid-season, and that obviously played a part. You were rushing to get back, and we're trying to load you as appropriately as we could, but it's always a tough part, isn't it? Like you've got these games in mind that you're trying to achieve, but actually you should just let your body kind of get to where it needs to over time, right? Yeah,
I mean, at the end of the day, it's your career, it's your life. You'll have people telling you, it's just bowl through today for me, or you've got one spell, but they don't have to deal with and I probably just wasn't strong enough or honest enough with myself to go, this is bowling shouldn't be like this. Like, it took all the fun out of it. It was just, but then I always just think, oh, tomorrow it'll be feeling okay, because it was sore, but not, so.
Unfortunately, this is probably a really common thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's the thing, and I guess tonight, if more people can get understanding of this, and then go, oh, actually, like, for the sake of 1 week of stopping, finding out what's going on, and kind of not being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff.
Fair enough. So, what things do you do differently now, Ed?
Well, the surgery helped. That made bowling fun again, and I associated bowling with pain for a couple of years there, but now it's actually all right. I mean, there's still some little pains, but it doesn't. I guess that you're always going to have little pain. I know your question. I'll just jump back to. But the stress fracture pain was never going away. It was almost getting worse the more I was bowling. Sometimes you get a bit of a stiff muscle, but as you warmed up, it comes right again. But this. Constantly just someone prodding at my back, and but what I do differently now is definitely more discipline around my loading. I have like an old sheep counter or umpire sort of thing, and so when I'm training I click at every ball, because I used to be guilty of it. The coach would say, oh, you got 6 overs today, and you're probably bowling for like 40 minutes. You're like, I think that's 6 overs, but I found a lot of the time it probably wasn't. So just being disciplined to stick to the exact number you're prescribed for that day, because there is a bit of a science to it, as you'll probably find out later. And then you're giving yourself the best chance to, when you go into a tournament or a bigger game or back-to-back games, you're more prepared for it, as opposed to a couple of shortcuts here and there, which unfortunately sometimes that's all it can take.
And like, is strength and conditioning a big part of what you do now?
Massively. Yep, I have to say this because Kingy's here too. But no, it is. Big believer in it. I mean, there's so many different theories, and I guess you just trust your trainers, and again, it just comes down to discipline. You just make sure you're doing everything you can, and mobility as well is key, I think, because bowling naturally just makes you, I'm stiff as a board anyway, but you got to try, I guess, again, be disciplined and just try to stay as flexible but as strong as well as you can, and then along top of following a good loading program, that's held me in good stead, and I haven't really had any proper back pain since, which is so fortunate. Again, there'll be muscle aches and stuff here and there, and don't get me wrong, there are other injuries that have crept in, but nothing as bad as the stressies. But I know now that pain was not a good pain.
Oh, it's good to see that you got the love of bowling back here. Cool.
No, for sure. Definitely, there was a while there where, and if you do have experienced it, I feel for you, because it isn't fun, and bowling should be fun, and that's the main thing. And if someone's making you go through something that you're not quite enjoying because your body's just in agony, again, they're not the ones that have to deal with it. You just tell them, no, this is my body, I'm making my decision here. So, and if it's not too bad, well, that's all right. You go again next week. So that's the worst that can happen.
All right, thanks, Ed. And any questions for Ed, we can we'll get them at the end, eh?
Cool. Thanks, Amos.
Right,
cheers, guys.
So I'd like to get Dr. Rob Campbell up to the stage now.
Okay, I'm going to wander around a bit. Hopefully you can hear me. I'll perhaps go over here a little more. So really my job, I hope, is to be able to explain a little bit of medical stuff. So there's a few docs and physios in the audience. So I just want to make sure that they get what we're doing, if you like, at the top end in terms of when we get presented with back pain, but also just some facts and figures and what is a stress fracture, what fractures, and how do we manage it, and most importantly from tonight, how do we prevent it? And we know that stress injuries to the bone in the back can be just a little bit of bone edema, a bit of stress. Then it goes potentially to a partial or incomplete fracture, and then it can go to a complete fracture. So those three different things are important, and it goes from one to the other to the other. So if we can get it early, we don't want to go to incomplete fracture or complete fracture. We just want a stress injury to the bone, which when then we can manage and doesn't sort of cause long-term problems. The part of the spine which fractures is called the pars, and for those of you who are not lucky enough to do Latin when you're at school, the pars is the Latin word for bridge, and the pars is the part of the bone that is the bridge between the two joints. So the articularis is joint, so the joint there and the joint there, and the pars is in the middle there. And that's the bit that comes under stress. So I hope none of you are squeamish. This is a model of plastic. When you back bend, extend, you compress onto the pars. So when you back bend, and that will be talked about later in terms of technique, extending your back backwards is the thing that stresses the pars. So technique's going to be important. And that's the part. Okay, that's where the fracture occurs. Why do bowlers get stress fracture? Well, that's what we're going to talk about the rest of the night in terms of technique, load, and perhaps whether you've had an injury before, and strength and conditioning is an important part in terms of prevention. Why is it important to prevent? I think I've touched on that, because we can have a little stress to the bone, then we can have a partial fracture, then we have a full fracture. Okay.
Rob, I've just gone to that point there. So obviously with a lumbar spine, we cannot cast it. So for them to heal, we need to keep people resting for very long periods of time. It's not like a normal fracture where you can put a cast on it and just get them to rest for 6 weeks. This takes a long time to heal. So it's not just 6 weeks out. We're talking months and months and months. Right, we'll move on.
Okay, so I just want to explain what happens when you stress. Any part of your body, whether it be muscle, tendon, ligament, bone, you train because you make it get stronger. So you stress it and then it recovers. And what happens in bone, if we start at the top with normal bone, we stress it with loading, whether it be bowling or running or weights or whatever. And what happens is the bone then gets stronger, but it does it in a way where the osteoclasts are the cells which take away some bone to allow the new bone to form. And if that happens nice and gradually, this takes away, you recover and rest, and then the osteoblasts are the bone builders. So they then make the new bone. So the problem we have sometimes is that if we stress this too quickly or too much, or for whatever reason with technique or whatever, or weakness, not enough conditioning, then the stress is more and this breaks down more and it hasn't got time to do this. So that's when we get this potential fracture through here time frame. And we know from experience that if you have a spike in bowling, which we'll talk about later, that is a sudden increase in bone, often the bone injury becomes symptomatic about 3 weeks later. That's when we've got not enough time for the osteoblast to work. So that's our sort of principle of why gradual loading is really important, and also avoidance of a sudden spike. Okay, thanks. Now this is a bit wordy, and I only want to make 4 points out of this. This is the Australian study published in January. It was fantastic. 13 years of research, 13 seasons where they've been looking at their bowlers, and they had nearly 800 bowlers. Okay, the bone stress injury is about 5 for every 100 bowlers per season, every 100 players I should say. How long did it take to get people back to playing? 6 months. 6 months. So if you get a fracture in season, your season is over. Finished. Right. Now, when I'm talking about 6 months, I'm talking about people who have a significant stress injury with an incomplete fracture. Complete fracture may be a little different. However, just take that figure 6 months, because that's the way we're trying to look at it now. Okay. And the biggest number of injuries were in the young, so relevant to today's, I guess, audience. 88% were fast bowlers, 8% spin bowlers. Somehow batsmen got stress fracture. I don't know quite how that happened. But anyway, maybe they were bowling in the nets. And there were no wicket keepers. So, if you get sick and tired of bowling, just become a wicket keeper. It's pretty safe. Okay. The gender, females break as well, so 17% female. Important point down here, stress reactions, that's no fracture, just a stretch reaction, 100% heal given the appropriate management. So not only do we want to manage them when they're stress fracture, we want to see them when they're this stage. Because when we get to incomplete fractures, about 80% healed. When we got a complete fracture through the bone, 50%. So we want to get them early, and we want to manage them as an early injury without a bone fracture. And then one important point, and Rowan's very happy to know that only 5 ended up in surgery out of 200 injuries. And that's the norm to some extent. Righto, for the clinicians, what do? What we want to know the history in terms of, is back pain aggravated by extension? What's happened? Have you loaded? Have you had previous injuries? What's your technique? And the technique will be, we'll talk about technique later. Well, Shane will, I won't. On the exam, our clinicians in the room, we know that we generally want to know what happens if we extend you. And if you're a coach, parent, bowler in the room, if you want to know if your back pain may be important, we call it an extension. We call it the stalk test. So what that is, you stand on one leg and like a stalk you go backwards. And if you're a right-handed bowler, you normally break on the left. So you break on the opposite side of your bowling arm, 90% or more of the time. Okay, so if I'm a right-handed bowler, I want to check my left-sided back pain, I'll be loading my up like this with stalk, and then I'll go back almost on an angle to really crush in on that left-sided bone. And if that's painful and stays painful, then we'd be really worried about it and we want to see you. So you can do your own testing if you get sore, and all the clinicians know how to do that. I test all nerve stuff, sacroiliac joint, leg length, test all that sort of stuff, and a bit of flexibility and strength stuff. But that's what we do. Okay, thanks. Okay, just some examples. Okay, so this is, you'll remember the diagram of the parser, hopefully. So what we see here is a break in that bone there. If we look at the one above, totally intact, we see the fracture through there. In the worst case scenario, not only does it fracture, but it becomes unstable and it slips forward. And if we look at the back of this called number L5 and number 4, you'll see that there's a step forward here. It should be all in a nice alignment down here. This is slipped forward. And the last thing, which I don't want to emphasise too much because it's a bit depressing, we look at the disc space, the disc sits in here, see how nice and wide that is? And then we go down to here and we've got a failing disc. So we've got a bone problem, we've got a slip, and we've now got a disc problem. And what we know is that bones can heal given a chance. Discs as a rule don't. So if you damage your disc significantly, and this is significant, then that's potentially a problem. And we know from the Australian studies that the bowlers who had a complete fracture had far more symptoms both at the time and long term. So this is the examinations. This is one of the things we do. Now, you may have heard of, we get x-rays in everybody, and that last slide showed why we get x-rays, because sometimes we uncover things that we weren't expecting. Then we used to do CTs. Now we do MRIs with a technique called VIBE, which, if you ask me, I'll tell you, but you won't understand it because I don't, for a start. It's a volumetric interpolated breath holding examination, but none the wiser. A CT shows the fracture up through that bone there. An MRI with VIBE shows the same thing. So we are now able to look at these things if we need to every 3-4 months or whatever we want to, if we want to serial, with the safety of MRIs, which has no radiation, whereas CT do. So that's why we like doing the MRIs with VIBE, which gives us the same information. Okay. So this is just to give you an example. When we do an MRI, it shows, if there's a bone injury, it shows a stress reaction. That white there is abnormal. So that's the bone trying to heal. You can see this is normal up here, but that's bony. Then that went on to an MRI vibe. You can see it's not obvious that there's a fracture there, but then we did the MRI with vibe, and we see this fracture going all the way, pretty much all the way through there. So that's a complete fracture because it's gone all the way through. So that's what we can get out of when I say plain MRI, an MRI, this is the vibe sequence. Thanks, Amos. Almost the last thing, our last point that I want to make about the discs. This is a 30 plus 31-year-old maybe, first class player, and we can see here there is a little slip, but he's got no pars injury, so no bone injury, but we can see a disc down here which is failing, and it's got a reaction in the bone around the disc. The point I'm making here, our good conditioning, our good loading, and a good sort of technique hopefully prevents this disc injury, because the point about it is discs don't recover well. Bone can heal. Perfect discs above here. White, 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 dark and white bone edema around the disc. So that's a failing disc. And someone who's still playing first class cricket. So it's not the end of the world. Okay.
So now I'm just going to cover off some of the main risk factors that we have for stress fractures. So we do know that the faster you bowl, the more force you put through the body, the more at risk you are of developing a stress fracture. We know that there's certain techniques that make you more at risk, and Shane and Greg are going to go through those soon. As Rob was talking before, spikes and load, deloading and overloading, that's also something that can make you more at risk. Health is a really important one. I think we probably don't touch on it as much as we should. But things like previous illness, nutrition, alcohol consumption, sleep, these kind of things all play a part, and we probably need to do a little bit more with our athletes around this. Then we go into previous injury. If you've had an injury in your adolescence, you're 2.5 times more likely to have a stress fracture in your later years. So if we can prevent those, that's going to make you far less likely in the future. Age is a really important one, and that's probably why we've got all you guys here today. Your bones don't fully mature in your spine until you're about the age of 24. So it's really, really common in this group, and it's still common once you hit up into those early 20s. But once you get past that time, the rate dramatically declines. And the other one, which is a relatively new one that's come forward, is height as well. So the taller you are, the more likely you are to have a stress fracture. So we've got two kinds of risk factors there. We've got non-modifiable ones and then modifiable ones. And we're going to be trying to talk about the modifiable ones today. So we'd like to get up now. Oh, actually, one more thing. So the other thing that's hard with New Zealand, especially is the scheduling. So we have a relatively short summer, and we're a big winter sport country, and that means that quite often it's hard to get onto proper surfaces early, and so we're doing things like we're on artificial turf for a long time, and then we're onto grass quite quickly, and then we're playing matches. We have things like we're going away for pre-season tours, and sometimes that's a really big struggle because there's lots of games in a very short space of time. And then we have the Christmas period, which generally means that everyone goes on holiday for 2 weeks, and we forget about cricket, and then we come back, and then we've got a massive tournament on following that. The other thing about being an island is obviously that it rains, it pours, and then it's 2 weeks out, and quite quickly that can really hamper a bowler's load. And then probably the final thing, and Ed really touched on this before, is how important success is. And like things like Gillette Cup or really important matches. We think it's a really massive deal at school, and then then you end up having a big injury, and then you may not play much cricket following that ever again. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges and risks, but hopefully we can have a chat about some of those and get to the bottom of them. So I'd like to get Shane and Greg up now, and they're going to touch on technique and loading.
Hi everyone. My speeches or talk is probably going to be a bit more uplifting than Rob's, so I hope you're pretty on fire with all sitting through that. It's pretty bleak. I've gone through that process. I started playing at 6, finished at 34, had 6 fractures in my back. So one in L1, one in L4, 4 in L5, and I was the first bowler to get the surgery that ruined our performance. 2 bowlers like this on the screen. So obviously here you've got 6 of the best bowlers in the world. 2 of them have had the surgery, Jofra Archer, Jasprit Bumrah, all of them have had stress fractures. So the stuff that I'm talking to you guys about, there's a lot of young faces in the crowd, is still applicable to these guys. It's exactly the same stuff, so that's really important. So we'll go through the technical side, and I'll try and make it as simple as I possibly can, the things that you want to look out for as a parent or as a coach. What I would say is, it's really hard. If you want to go through the 4 biomechanics, I'll talk about mixed actions and something. I went through one where you bowl in your undies with all the ping pong balls around, with all these high-speed cameras, and you go through that sort of assessment. Now, I did that, and my 2 coaches, 2 of the best coaches in New Zealand, actually Ross and Dale Hadley, thought my action was fine. The scan said otherwise. So it's really hard to see. Even though I think I've got years of experience, it's still hard for me. So for you guys with not much or just looking, it's tough. What I would say is we do have one tool where you can sort of check your son or daughter, and that's your iPhone. Get your phone out, film it, pause it, run back and through, and you can sort of have a look at the stuff that I'm going to talk about now and around technique. Okay? So this is the 2 questions I always get asked, whether it be net bowlers, parents, kids. Number 1 is, how do I bowl faster? That's all everyone's interested in. Technique, strength, fitness, attitude, it's all the same stuff. But I want to run like Usain Bolt, but I can't. Right? Because everybody's got a cap. Everybody's got a limit that they can bowl to. Cricket is a skill-based game. At the end of the day, you need something that's repeatable, something that's safe. You need to be able to put the ball where you want the ball up the ball. The top best bowlers of all time bowl 135 k's in most. They just put the ball where they can, and it moves around the room. That's what makes it successful. So, although everyone loves fast bowling and it's exciting, it's not the most important thing. The second part is, what does a good technique look like? And if I go back to that, there's some techniques that you'd say probably not quite over coaching. Right? Everybody does it different, and that's the thing for me, is there's no wrong or right. Everyone has their own way. My job is sort of try to make it as effective and efficient as I can. But I'm never going to change that guy from bowling like that. Right? It's crazy. So, how do I go about my coaching? Well, the first step is the run-up. Like, the run-up leads in to the bowling action itself. So does anyone know Newton's third law of motion? Anyone? Yeah. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So, everything that you do through the action or through your run-up will have an impact on what you do at the bowling crease. So I'm looking for the cause and then the effect of that cause. So I always start at the run-up. And you'll often see, if you watch your own Kids Plus or in the nets, kids love running a big curve, they dive in, they do all those sorts of things. And what I try to do is just get kids to run straight at the target. Pretty simple stuff. Because if they're running straight at the target, the chances of bowling there are higher. As a parent or a coach, the one tip I'd give would be, even in the first session of bowling, walk back to the top of your full mark, your runner, and walk through to the half runner and start on the same angle, because you create the same habit. Often kids go a little bit wider than they would normally be, and so they end up running this curve because it becomes an ingrained pattern. That make sense? Second part, there are sort of considered 3 actions. The open action, the 45, and the sideline. So, what you're looking for really Although the feet give you a clue here, it's the hips and the shoulders align. I was a little bit different. I was this, but my foot was closed. So side on foot, open chest. So it's really, when you're looking at your kids, look at the hips. First thing you look at is the hips, and then the shoulders, do they line up? So they said front on, I'm directly at you, 45, side. Make sense? The problem comes in when you have hip and shoulder separation. So the hips, they're open and that's closed. That's the risk code. That's what you're looking for, and that's at back foot contact. So when you're filming your son, your daughter, on your phone, when their back foot hits the ground, you look at their hips and then you see where their shoulders are. If they're aligned, good start. Make sense? The thing is with that creates pace. That's the worst thing. It will create power. You have the torque, that twisting motion will enable you to go faster. So the question you always have as a coach is, if someone's bowling 150 kilometres an hour or really fast, can you change that action? That's a tough one. Can't answer that question. The second part is what we call shoulder counter rotation. So you'll see here with this bowler, hips and shoulders align at the point of back foot contact. Okay? Now it's the transition between back foot contact and front foot contact. Look what happens with those shoulders. Okay, the shoulders close. That's called shoulder counter rotation. So in an ideal world with this athlete, open hips, open shoulders, all the way through the action, you would keep it the same. If you close off by more than 30 degrees, massive increase in risk of injuries, particularly if you read down here, teenage fast bowlers, male in particular. So that's the second point that you are looking for, is that. Does that make sense? And then Greg, I'll hand you on to this.
Thanks a lot. So I'm going to talk a bit about a couple of other risk factors that have sort of started to come out with some other research that's been done. And this is really the knee and the hip bend. And this was a study that was done in the UK through the ECB. And they followed 50 first-class elite level bowlers. And they looked at them, or assessed them at the start. All of them didn't have injuries before the start of the examination, and then they followed them for 3 years, and then they saw the ones that did get stress fractures and the ones that didn't, and then they obviously looked at that biomechanical assessment that they did to see which risk factors came out strongly. And the most important finding that sort of came out of that was the knee and the hip bend that happened, and I want to show you some examples of when we talk about that knee bend and that hip bend, what it might look like. Now, so this is Mike might recognize this academy. This is in Chennai, in India. So this is some of the guys we assessed over there. It was actually for my PhD, but this was more around performance, but it's always interesting to look at some of the footage that we get. And this is quite a basic assessment, just like Shane was saying, that you can do on your phone. You don't need anything fancy to do the assessment. So when we talk about the hip and the knee bending, obviously we're talking about that hip angle, that flexion there, and the knee angle bending as well. Now this is not extreme. You will get more extreme cases. I'm highlighting this more so you can understand what the hip and the knee angle is. But what we see is that back foot contact. When that knee is quite flexed at back foot contact, that was one of the risk factors that they identified. And what this does is this bent hip, bent knee, it seems to translate further on into the action where you can see a large lateral flexion. So that's a side bending. And that's another risk factor that's come through a number of different studies to say that this is a red flag for stress fractures. So when you see your player, your son, your daughter with large bending at the back leg, that's something that you need to start thinking about trying to correct, and that's trying to get them more upright. And that sort of starts falling into the area where I'm involved, and that's doing things to try and strengthen those limbs and to strengthen the midsection or the torso so that we can limit the collapse that happens at that back leg and obviously limit the amount of flexion, excessive flexion. Now flexion is going to happen, that lateral bending is going to happen. You can't stop that, it's part of bowling. But we want to try and reduce it as much as possible and make that that trunk really strong and resilient so that it doesn't flex too much. The other aspect of, well, and Shane was talking about it, the performance aspect and the injury aspect. When we talk about strengthening that torso, strengthening that core, there's a benefit to both areas. So if we can strengthen that core, we can transfer those forces, so we get huge amount of force that's driven from our legs and our hips, and that goes through our midsection to our arms to generate that ball speed. Okay, if you have a soft and a weak core, then obviously you're going to have what we call an energy leak, and so a lot of that force is dissipated, or you lose a lot of that efficiency. So by strengthening the core and strengthening those limbs, you actually make yourself more efficient, better performer. But on top of that, if you can actually make yourself more rigid through the legs and more rigid through the core, you actually limit the amount of flexion and excessive movement that happens in that area, and hopefully also reduces the amount of stress that's happening on the lumbar spine. So one more here. And this is just another example, and in this case, you can see both of those bowlers side by side. One of them is really legs falling away quite a lot. The flexion is not excessive, but those are things that I'd work with the bowling coach on. How could we try and get that athlete a little bit more upright, stop that head falling away? Shane was talking about it as well, is there's a lot of that starts from the run-up. So that back foot contact, when we have that big bend, it oftentimes starts from an incorrect run-up, and that's why we need to address those things. So I can help a little bit in the gym by making players stronger, but the technical aspect has to go hand in hand with that strength. That's it a bit? Yeah. That bit? Yeah, thanks, mate.
So in summary, if you're coaching or looking at your son or daughter play, starts with the runner. Ideally with the runner, what you're looking for is for momentum to be at least carried through the crease, if not accelerating in the last 5 metres and running straight. That's what you're looking for. Even with spin bowlers, you're looking to accelerate through the crease in the last few metres of bowling. Once you get to the crease, you're looking at that back foot contact, hips and shoulders aligned, and then to front foot contact that there's not too much movement. That's what you can look for on your phone. And if you see something on your phone that you think you're a little bit concerned about, that's when you can reach out to a professional coach for an opinion. But as I said, it's really tough to change. If I do anything with my players, I always look at the hips and try to use the shoulder as a correction. So the easiest thing to do as a bowler is you can sort of feel what you're doing here. Really tough to know what you're doing down here. It sort of just happens. So I look at the video, and I've got a 16-year-old son I'm going through all this stuff with now, and go, okay, where do you feel your hand? Where do you feel your shoulder? Is it in the right spot? I show them the video. If you want to create some awareness, get them to hold something in their hand, or put a rubber band around their fingers so they can sort of feel where their hand is. Create some awareness, and that's the thing that you use your shoulder in particular to line up with your hips. Make sense? Is there any questions around technique that you want to ask now before we move on to loading? Crickets? Happy to move on? Sweet. Okay, bowling loading, this is really exciting stuff. There's always a lot of chat about bowling loading and what it means, and there's a few technical terms in here as well. I'll try and keep it as simple as I possibly can. Okay? 3 main points: frequency, obviously how often you do it, how much you do, and how hard you do it. They're the 3 main things around bowling loading. Okay? These are probably the 3 main points. I'll just say something about that. I think when you're getting to sort of first 11 level, it's particularly relevant. I think that's there. Maybe 13, 14. Maybe that number just drops a little bit to the lower end of 20, maybe 18 overs. It's a little bit too high. But you can adjust that figure anyway. This year, obviously more than 4 sessions a week is a risk. Okay? Under 2 sessions a week is actually even more of a risk. So under bowling is just as much a risk as over bowling. So it's really important that consistency of bowling in sessions, that you continue to do that. So when you talk about dropping load or having a rest week, that's not bowling. You've still got to bowl a couple of sessions a week. What you've got to do is perhaps drop the intensity down a little bit. Okay? And the last one is research says that, like lifting weights, having a day on, day off is particularly important, like Rob said, giving the bone the opportunity to heal. Now we know with cricket, there's Saturday, Sunday games, there's tournaments. I still, even with my son, have got him to bowl back-to-back days at a low intensity because I'm still trying to prepare his body for what's coming up and getting him to bowl in 2 spells, doing all the things to prepare him as best as I possibly can. So even though that's best practice, the reality is it's not practical in some situations. So I'm going to use a few metaphors here. Who lifts here? Who lifts weights? Anyone? No one. One person lifts weights. Who's a couch potato? Who does bugger all in terms of exercise? Don't be shy, put your hand up. I'm talking one of those. And the last one, does anyone do sort of running, walking as exercise? Okay, so I'm going to try and use maybe more of an analogy around that stuff in terms of bowling loading, okay? I'm just going to give you a couple of terms here that you'll hear a lot of bowling talk about. Really it means short term, long term. That's acute and chronic, okay? So acute load means what have you bowled in the last 7 days? That's not from Monday to Sunday, it's the last 7 days. And it keeps rolling on all the time, okay? So when you're looking at your bowling loading, don't look at it from Monday to Sunday, just look at it over the last 7 days. What have you done over the last 7 days? If I give an example, if you bowled Friday, Saturday, Sunday, bowled 10 overs, and then each day, and then bowled Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 10 overs, that would be 60 overs in 6 days, high risk. If you measured it from Monday to Sunday, it would be 30 overs a week, which would be okay. But the reality is that's not. So that's why I'm talking about using it as a rolling 7 days. The same as the chronic load, it's measured over 28 days. The same thing. So what you're trying to do is get your chronic load higher over time. That's what we talk about bowling. I'll give you an example in a second. And a spike is when if you're averaging 20 overs a week and you bowl above 30, that's a spike. And that's where your risk of getting injured goes up. So how would I best sum this? Think about if you're a couch potato, which I am, and you decide that you're just going to go out now and I'm going to play touch rugby. I'm going to go hard. It's a tournament, my mates ask me to play. If I go out there and I sprint and I run and I do it for 2 hours, pretty good chance that I'm going to go pop. Because my age, the intensity is too high and the load is too high. It's the same as bowling. Okay? If I give it another example, if you're planning the start of the season, 10 overs is what you're going to maybe bowl at the start of the season. I want you to think of 10 overs like 10 kilometre walk. So every K is 1 over. Now, even me, who hasn't done a lot of exercise, could probably go out today and walk 6 kilometres. Pretty comfortably, okay? So when I look at this, so I'll go to this first, level 1, 2 and 3. Have anyone here level 1, 2, 3 has heard this stuff? Heard it? So this is just what we talk about in terms of bowling exertion. So level 1, half a run up, pretty relaxed, 70% of your pace, but probably about 50 to 60% of your effort. Level 2, 3/4, and level 3 gain intensity. That's what we talk about in terms of intensity with bowling. Now, you guys will know that kids are hard to moderate intensity because they just feel good and they want to steam in and they're competitive. What I would say as a parent or coach is monitoring that and managing that is crucial. So I'll go back to my previous point. Level 1, 10 Ks. I could go out and walk 6 days tomorrow. Probably be a little bit stiff, but I'd be okay. Now, if I did that every second day for 2 weeks, I could probably get up to 10 Ks. Pretty comfortable. Right? That's what low-level bowling is like. Within 2, 3, 4 weeks, you could get up to bowling 10 overs at a low level or building your volume up. Okay? Now, if you're doing the same thing with weights, doing high reps, low weight, after 2 or 3 weeks, you get used to that and it'll just become easier. And so naturally, you just get a little bit stronger. Naturally, I'd walk a little bit faster. Make sense? Then what I do after walking for 3 or 4 weeks, I'll start to bring in some jogging. And I'll slowly do more jogging as the sessions went on. You know, I might jog for 2K, then I'll jog for 3K, then I'll jog for 5K, then I'm going to jog for 10K. It's exactly the same with bowling. That's what you do. You bring a couple overs, slightly longer run up, and then makes that other low level stuff. So the volume doesn't change, the intensity just starts to build. Until you get to the point where you go, I'm feeling pretty good now, I can run at race speed. I can run my 10K at the speed that I'm going to run a race. And the same thing you do again. You might a couple of k's walking, a couple of k's jogging, and then another couple of k's full steam. And eventually, after hopefully about 6 to 10 weeks ideally, you'll be doing 10 overs 3 times a week at race pace, ready for the season. Now, obviously, for younger athletes, that might be down to 6 overs 3 times a week, and you'll be ready to go. So this is a graph that shows acute and chronic loading. I know it's a bit heavy, but what it shows here is all the individual bowling, the overs per week. There's sort of 4 days between sessions here. And this athlete's been bowling, and what you see is over time that chronic load goes up and builds up and up. Obviously at the start when you're bowling the risk is there's a spike, but we can't control it. We have to start, but at low level the risk of getting injury, if you moderate that level of intensity, you should be fine. And what we do over time is we make sure that that line there isn't much higher than there. And if you do that, you slowly build that chronic load up to a level that builds resilience into a bowl. Make sense? Clear as mud. So what can you do as parents or as coaches? Number one is just keep a diary of how much you bowl. So I've got my son on notes. He's writing in the day of the session, how many overs at level 1, how many overs at level 2, did he bowl 2 spells, and the surface that he's bowled on. So if there's an injury, you can look back and go, did I over bowl, did I under bowl? You've got a point to reflect on it each time you do it. I use this with my elite bowlers though, because I hate doing this stuff. Hate it. But I look at it as a performance aspect. I tell them if I know exactly how much you've bowled, and they start bowling well, it's the perfect sign of how I prepare you next time you get you into peak form. So it's also a sign of how do I bowl to my best. Talk to your coach. You have, and this one is, these go hand in hand. You have to look ahead. So rather than just go to practice and go, yeah, I'm going to bowl, you have to go, well, what games are coming up? Do I have a rep training? Do I have an inter-school game? Am I playing on Wednesday? Have I got a game on Tuesday and Thursday, but I've got training on Wednesday? So you've got to look ahead to your week and go, okay, I've got 6 days of cricket this week. Which days am I going to bowl? And I need to have a chat to my coach about perhaps I'm bowling on Wednesday because I've got 3 games in a row. That's really important, and as coaches it's really important to listen to the kids. It's actually a really tough one to do as a kid to go to training and go, I'm going to ask the coach not to bowl. That's really hard. But they're discussions I'd love you to have with your parents. Even the parents call the coach and go, hey, my son's been bowling, my daughter's been bowling 3 days in a row, 2 days in a row, they need a day off tomorrow. I need them to have a rest. As I said, the preparation and looking ahead rather than just reacting day to day is really important. Is there any questions around loading? Or I'm hoping that was reasonably clear. Any questions around that? Yes, Simon. Thank you.
So obviously when our kids down the net, get them out of the house, and the boys just want to back to back, so the bowlers bowl and bowl. So obviously with our old shoulders we throw. I feel we should be getting our kids doing more throwdowns to the batsmen. But is the throwing having an influence on the loading for you or Greg or Amos or something? You know what I mean?
I'll leave the
5 overs, so then they should throw. Is that influencing their bowling rate?
I don't think so. I think the bottom line is if you were the prototypical teenager that I was, I want to go to the park every day and bowl. And then my mates would come over and we'd play in the backyard. And so we'd end up just bowling because it was fun. Like nuts. When you're young, it's fun. We love going to the nets, love imitating the bowlers that we see on TV, love trying to replicate the skills that we see. But it's just really important to have those conversations. Obviously it's easy with you guys who are here now, but it's just how much you're involved in it. If you want to keep count, like Ed talked about his little numbers thing, as coaches get your players to bowl in overs. So if you've got 4 bowlers, 2 on, 2 off, 6 balls, 6 balls, 6 balls, so they can count it. Or put some balls on the ground and they kick one away every time they bowl an over, so they can count the 6 balls. Be creative about the ways you can find for them to count those balls. But the bottom line is, the intensity is the hardest one. Like you young guys will bowl a couple of sessions and go, I'm feeling good stuff. And my mate's in the nets and he's whacking me and I don't like this and I'm in the steam and I'm going to knock his head off. And it's really just pull your intensity back. Just pull your intensity back and spend as much time as you can building it up. Now some of you, who hasn't started bowling yet? Now, who hasn't? So you've got, 7 weeks, 8 weeks, so it's getting tight now, right? So you've got to get that low level bowling in now, and then just slowly increase that level of volume and intensity as we get closer to the season. But it's just, if you have that diary, my thing would be spending 3 to 4 weeks at level 1, blend it in with maybe on the 4th week with some level 2, the same again at level 2, and then you've got 2 to 3 weeks at the back end where you've got some level 3 bowling in. You probably don't need 30 overs at level 3, but you probably need around 20 if you're a 17, 18-year-old fast bowler. Maybe 15 if you're a 13. That would be my advice to you.
What happens if at Christmas time, like say cricket finishes on December 20th, does it start in January 20th? Do you have to go through the same build-up process again?
I think one of the biggest things, if you speak to, I mean it's really tough here obviously because of the seasons and you guys aren't professionals, is most international fast bowlers will tell you they don't really want to stop because the biggest risk is when you stop. So they might have a week off to let everything settle down and then they just start again. A couple of times a week just ticking over. So it's really hard when you're at Wanaka and everyone's boating to want to go down to the nets and get a couple of sessions of bowling in. I mean, that was my son last year, it didn't happen, you know, and so and that's the risk when a couple of kids come out of the holidays and get stress fractures. And the sad thing about a stress fracture is it's impacted, not only impacts your summer sport, it can impact your winter sport, you miss your winter season as well. So it's a horrible injury to get. The only thing I can say is, wherever you go and play, take your boots and do some sort of bowling. If it's a tennis ball in the backyard, then it's a tennis ball, but at least you're doing something. So it's just trying to keep up, as I said, twice a week in the holiday period is better than doing nothing. Any other questions around loading?
How does the, I understand the loading and the process of what's going on. How, in the future particularly, I guess, how do the school, the club, the rec, how do they all start working in to actually all agree with the loading or put that back on the students, the youth, to sort of say, okay guys, you've got recs this day, school this day, you know, that kind of thing. Is that kind of something that's being looked at as well?
That's a great question. I think, like for me, is I still put the onus at this level on the coach. They're the questions the coach should be asking a young bowler. How much have you bowled this week? How many times have you bowled this week? Actually today we're going to give you a rest. That's a duty of care. I always think that's my job with top bowlers, is a duty of care to look after them. So as much as we want to encourage 15-year-old boys to write in their phone, the reality is that's challenged. So as the adult and as the coach, I would take some responsibility around that. And then work in it. Yep, it's not ideal that I don't have a net bowler, but I don't want to put my player at risk. It's not worth the risk. So as a parent, I'll be having those conversations with my coach, like always, like how much is he bowling, especially if there's trips or tournaments. What are you looking to do? When are you looking to play him? Are you going to give him a rest day? Those sort of conversations are really important. As the young players here, we want to play, right? We want to play every day. It's hard. You're not bowling today. I can tell you, it's better than not bowling for 6 months or playing from experience, because it's hard work, and having seen some young players now go through the stress fractures, like it's really tough. Like it's shattering, because it's the thing you love to do and you can't do it. And as I said to you, for some of the athletes I've seen, they haven't been able to do anything for months on end, and that's really hard. So they're the things, and I say this that even when players get injured, you're better to take a week at the front end, spending a little bit more time to get right, than rush back and it costs you 6 months. And so it's just being a little bit more conservative around your rehab. Whatever the injury is, being conservative and building back into it. That's a great question.
Most of the players that I work with are multi-sport, and their winter seasons are quite long. The rep season for football and basketball, it continues into the next holidays. There's about a 2-week window between when they stop and cricket starts. What kind of physical condition from those sports move into cricket, if any?
Look, I think another good question. It's good they're doing a sport because they're going to have some sort of conditioning, which is better than no conditioning. So, I mean, I know when I had my first stress fracture, I gave up rugby, didn't do enough training, and broke it back. So lost all the strength and conditioning. So, I want players to be doing different sports. Do I think you could play cricket all year round? Yeah, I do. I think if you wanted to bowl all year round, then why not? But I know there's a balance of better or say there's a winter and summer sport, but you have to, cricket's a sport, particularly as a bowler, that you have to prepare for. Because if you don't, you're going to end up with injuries that we've talked about. So the same conversation we had with the cricket coach, I'm having with the football coach. Look, my son is a bowler, he needs to start bowling. How do we moderate his training a little bit to enable him to be best prepared for his winter sport? Now, for some players, the winter sport may be more important, and so you might make a decision. For others, the summer sport is the most important sport. So again, you've got to prioritise what it is, but all you can do is have that conversation. And I think a good coach will listen to that. Because obviously you've got to be aware of the total load of the training and the volume of training, because my son's going through it, the basketball, the bowling, he's tired, he's sick, all those sort of things that you're dealing with. But you've just got to have those chats with your coaches. Awesome. Cool, thanks guys.
Just to, if I can add something. Medically, I'd like to add something positive. From the point of view of bone density, it's been clear that all sport increases your bone density. Doesn't matter what it is. Second thing is bowlers, both female and male, have a higher bone density on their contralateral side. The side that fractures is the side that you're not, you're right-handed, your left side. But on right-handed bowlers, their left-sided bone density is higher. So all of bowling increases your bone density, so that's what we want, the bone density to be resilient. And in females, the English study shows it's about 2.5 standard deviations above the other side, which is already stronger because they're active. So a positive is if you train, you increase your bone density. And that's a really important point to keep it going. The second point about that is if we then rest you for 3 or 4 months, 5 months, because you've got a fracture, that increased bone density is lost. So that's why it takes so long to build it back up again, because we're not getting back to average bone density. We've got to get it back to what was your normal bone density, which is increased. And we've got to get that back up. So that's why we have to be conservative, and hopefully, of course, that's why we prevent them.
Thanks there, Rob. So this is a pathway that we came up with 4 years ago, and this has probably been one of the real successes of this whole initiative. So when a player does get back pain, we've been able to come through, see a physio, and get referred to the sports doctor, and then get a scan relatively urgently. I think our record is 3 days so far. So that's a pretty awesome turnaround, and then we're getting results really quickly. So even if they're negative, it means we can get them back to sport really early. And if they do have something that's going on, we're catching it early, and then that helps to prevent, the major stress fractures that are keeping people out of the sport. So again, if you get back pain, especially with what Rob was saying earlier, that extension side flexion, then you want to catch up with a physio or one of the sports doctors. Then if the physio sees you and you've still got back pain, then we get you to review with someone like Rob or one of the other sports physicians. Then they'll organise scans for you if they deem appropriate. And all of the sports physicians across Christchurch are all over this. They've been really awesome, and they've got onto it really well. And then generally the review gets done pretty quick, and then we can work out what we do from there. If things turn out fine, we just go back through that same process of, like if you don't have a stress fracture, getting your technique reviewed, getting a bit of rehab, and once you're pain-free, getting back into gradually building up your bowling again. But if something does go wrong, then this is the timeline that we've been talking about. So generally after a stress injury, so that can be a reaction all the way through to complete fracture, we generally would have a period of about 6 weeks relative rest. You're still walking around, you can do a bit of cycling, but you're not doing too much. Then following that 6-week period, we're into a bit of rehab, so then we would start increasing the intensity a little bit. You'd be starting to do a little bit of strength and conditioning work as well. Now, depending on the severity of that injury, sometimes they start at 4 months, sometimes it's a little bit later if it's a more serious one, but around about that 4 to 6 months, that's when we start building back into bowling. So you're looking at kind of 7 to 9 months to return to competition generally. And that's been what we've been working off over the last couple of years. So here's some of the really important physio considerations. So if you've got a young fast bowler, and this is actually relevant to a lot of extension-based sports, so gymnasts, swimmers who do butterfly as well. If you have back pain with extension, then we've got a high suspicion of stress fractures. So one thing we really want to check with our athletes is what was your previous bowling load, and go back through that whole last month, and has there been any previous injuries, has there been anything, have they had an illness where they took a week or 2 off, those kind of things. And if you can look back at that, you can actually look to the future as well, and actually plan how that player's going to go that next season. Winter sports load, as we were talking just before, that's a really important part. We have lots of players that coming off a big rugby season or a basketball season, and I agree, they're really important, but sometimes we just need to start a little bit later. And what do we do to physically prepare our athlete? Well, Greg's going to come up and talk a few points there, and I might just chip in as well. But sometimes it still doesn't work. Okay, you get through, you've done all the rest and stuff, and you still fail. And we're lucky today. We're going to have Rowan come up and talk to us about what happens then, and what those conversations with his athletes are when they come in to see him.
So hi everyone. So my name's Rowan Sheldon. I'm an orthopaedic spine surgeon, and I guess my role is to sort of put some sort of perspective about where surgery fits in the management of stress fractures. And I think it's probably wise just to explain to everyone straight up that universally, I think everyone around the world, and regardless of what sport you're in, but particularly cricket, if you get a stress fracture, then it's universally considered that first-time stress fractures are almost always treated non-surgically, first up. So when we're talking about surgery here, I don't want anyone thinking that we're going straight into surgery off the bat. Almost everyone, without exception, would have a non-surgical treatment, and that follows that 6-month rehab program that Amos has just pointed out. And so surgery is really reserved for the small number of cases where that non-surgical treatment has failed. And what does that look like? Well, typically, that failure is what we call a recurrence. So typically, you have a stress fracture, you'll go through that 6 months of rehab, and then on return to play, if you're unlucky, you can have another fracture in the same location, at the same level. So that's a recurrence. And unfortunately, once you have a recurrence, then you're faced with the prospect of another 6 months off. And if that happens on a repeated basis, and you have 2, 3, 4 of those back to back, or that guy, then your career suddenly gets massively interrupted. And so that's the most common scenario where we consider surgery. So it's not, stress fracture does not equal surgery by any stretch of the imagination. It's a very small proportion of fractures that need surgery. I'm a spine surgeon. I do maybe 400 operations a year, and I do 10 operations for stress fractures, a very small part of my practice. When it comes to surgery, though, probably it's worthwhile just explaining what that surgery involves. So there's many ways of fixing stress fractures that have gone on to reoccur. The technique we use in Christchurch involves putting titanium screws and wires in the back in a way that compresses and stabilises the fracture so it's got a better chance of healing and a better chance of staying healed, making it more robust and more resilient. So I guess it's an operation that, first off, you should explain it's not a fusion. A lot of people, when they think of spine surgery, they think of fusion, where we fix one bit of bone to the next and that stops movement. This is not a fusion operation, this is just operating on one part of the bone, maintaining all the normal movements of the spine, all the biomechanics that are essential to fast bowl. And so that's a technique that we've used, and we've used in multiple players, and mostly adults. You know, in the age group like this, very rarely do we select surgery. Most of the time we're doing it in adults, but we've found in adults that has been a successful alternative to getting people back to play if they're having repeated interruptions from stress fractures, and that's a return to play rate of about 90% of these players who can get back and play uninterrupted for the rest of their career. It's not bulletproof, but it's a reasonable bailout option if that that initial non-surgical treatment does not work. As far as the rehab goes, that's one other thing I just wanted to mention. Surgery may seem appealing. You might think you might be able to fast track yourself back into sport after surgery. That's not the case. The rehab following surgery is essentially the same as it is that non-surgical rehab. So it's a 6-month process. It's almost identical, apart from the first 2 weeks where you're sore as hell and you can't get into a swimming pool. It's very much the same. So surgery is not an accelerated pathway back to play. I guess that's what I wanted to say. That's all I just wanted to put some perspective on the role of surgery in this situation. I'm happy to take any other questions if people have it. Capiche?
Thanks, Rowan. So now we're going to have Greg come up and just talking us through some strength and conditioning essentials.
Thanks. All right, I'll try and keep it fairly short and just touch on a few aspects of strength and conditioning. A lot of it will deal around strengthening mostly. So when we talk about strengthening, obviously everyone thinks of gym, getting in, lifting heavy weights, maybe getting nice and big. But there's a few things that we really need to consider when we're strengthening for cricket or for any sport for that matter. And that's the stages we like to take the players through. And the first thing is making sure that we're developing movement quality and competency before we start putting strength on any movement patterns. So when an athlete comes in to see me, the first thing I look to do is how do they move? That's the most important thing. And we start making sure that they have some basic movement patterns and they can do those with good quality movements before we start trying to put a sort of strength on those patterns. Once we do that, we also want to start looking at that trunk control, which I spoke about earlier, making sure that they have good trunk control, nice and strong through the trunk region, and that we can get some strength in that area. Once we've got that, then I will start putting more and more strength into them. And then initially what we start with is, we start with what we call bilateral strength. So that's when you're doing things with both legs or both arms at the same time. But what we want to do from there is we want to move very quickly onto asymmetrical strength, one-sided strength, or strength where it's offset. So what we've got to understand is we're playing sport where it's a one-sided sport. Most sports, you're doing things with one leg or one arm at a time. So you need to move to patterns that are more asymmetrical or more singular. So we start moving them to those patterns, those types of movements, and we start trying to build strength in those patterns. Once we've done that, only once we've gone through those stages, do I start putting power into the movements. So that's explosiveness. And you can speak to Ed because he goes through this process with me, that we start off, it's movements, I'm on top of them all the time about the quality of their movements. We're always correcting their movements, there's always fine-tuning little things when they're in the gym, and we want to make sure that the quality of the movement that they do in the gym is exceptional. It's not just about going there and lifting weights and trying to see something on Instagram or TikTok and say, I'm going to try and do this exercise or that exercise, or I'm going to try and load these weights on. We're really, really interested in how they move, and that's pretty important for me. In terms of the conditioning, because we spoke a little bit about it, or it's come up in various questions over the time that I've been involved, and that's what type of conditioning do we need to do for cricket. So I think when athletes are playing a lot of winter sport, that is a good conditioning base for them. And you should be happy that they're playing other sports, particularly if they're running-based sports or cardiovascular-based sports. Those are important. In terms of the types of training we do for the cricketers, if they're not playing those winter type sports, then we want to make sure that we look at the patterns that are involved. Now, as a fast bowler, you have a range of very short to very long. The short stuff is at a reasonably high intensity, but it's very short duration. How long does it take you to do a run-up? It's only a few seconds, right? And then you're going to spend long periods on the field, but those long periods that you spend on the field are at a very low intensity. So you need to do some work in that area. So with our cricketers, and Ed will attest to this, we do a lot of short work at a much higher intensity, and then we do a lot of longer work at a much lower intensity, and that's what's important. That in-between region is not as important for cricket. It's not that you don't have to do it, but you just don't have to do as much of it. So 30, 40, 50 seconds at high intensity is not that important. The lower intensity stuff is very important, okay? That's long duration, low intensity, and then the high intensity stuff, but for very short duration. Those are the important aspects. You want to add anything? All right, and then just in terms of some of the patterns, so in the gym, the patterns that are important, so you want to make sure that you're working the full body. You want to make sure that you're doing pushing patterns. So when we're talking about pushing patterns, we're talking about things like push-ups, chest presses, shoulder presses. You'll probably be familiar with all of these, but you need to make sure that you're having some sort of pushing pattern. You need to make sure that you've got a pulling pattern. Okay, so that means a one-arm row, a pull-up, an inverted row, something where you're doing a pulling activity. You need to make sure that you've got a squatting pattern. You need to make sure that you've got a hinging pattern. Okay, so now a squatting pattern, most people know what I'm talking about when I say squatting. When I say hinging, what we're talking about is something like a hip thrust or an RDL, a single leg RDL. I've highlighted those two, okay, because Rob was talking about disc injuries earlier. And in the weight room, where we see the most disc injuries, deadlifts, conventional barbell deadlifts, conventional barbell back squats. Olympic lifting is another one that you have to be very careful with. So I'm not saying you mustn't do those exercises, but if you're going to do those exercises, you need to make sure you're coached properly. It is so important. Do I ever let you squat when I'm not watching? Back squat. Okay. So when they back squat, when they deadlift, I watch every single rep. If I'm not happy with the technique, we stop. We don't go heavier. All right. So you're much better off not doing those lifts if you cannot be coached properly. It's vital. Right? If you injure a disc, it takes a hell of a long time to come back to sport. Right? So it's not a stress fracture, but it's another injury that you don't want to be dealing with. When we're in the weight room, we're trying to make you more resilient so that you're less likely to get injured. So some exercises you have to be very careful with, and those are some of the ones I wanted to highlight. With regards to the core exercises, as I spoke about before, we want to do more movements where we're stopping movement. So we call it anti-rotation, anti-extension, anti-flexion. So what that means is, it just means that we stop the movement. So normally if we did a sit-up, we would be flexing forward. I don't want to do too much flexing forward. I actually want to stop you from flexing forward. So I'll do exercises that will brace you in that position. Extension backwards. I don't want to do too much extension backward, actual movement. So I'll do a movement where I might make you bridge or plank on your back, and so that stops that movement. Or we'll side plank. So those are the types of movements that I'm more interested in, because that builds the type of strength that we need. We can still do crunches and we can still do some of those conventional exercises, but those are way more important for fast bowling and for most other sports, because as I spoke about earlier, it stops that excessive movement in the spinal region, and it also allows us to transfer those forces that we're generating from the legs and the hips to the higher parts of the chain, to the arms and the legs. To the arms and the hands. And that's pretty much it.
Yeah, so really, really good points there. And what we're going to do is we've got a couple of training programs and examples of all these kind of exercises. And we're going to package them all together with some of our other slides that we've got from tonight, and so that you guys can access them in the future. So we're just going to quickly run through some of the conclusions, so some of the really important points. And like Shane was talking about earlier, we're trying to aim for those 2 to 4 sessions per week. And I don't know if we've mentioned this, but one thing if you're bowling 4 sessions per week, the next week we're not bowling 4 sessions a week. The next week's 3, all right? And then the other important bit was, we're trying to make sure we're resting after bowling. That day on, day off is a much better way of approaching it rather than day on, day on, day on. Those bowling loads of 21 to 32 overs, they seem to be kind of the sweet spot for our athletes, especially for the kind of 17, 18-year-olds. Keeping a bowling diary is so important, and not just for monitoring your loads and things, but actually if you do have one of those, and we can see it in the future, if you do have an injury, we've got some history to kind of work back from and then make some changes from there. Last couple of things, if you get back pain and you've been bowling, get to see a physio. And we've got some great physios here tonight, and we'll try and get them and their names on the Canterbury Cricket website or something like that, so you know where to go. Most people around here have a physio attached to their school, and I think we've got a few of them here, so they'll be a really good point of contact. And just the last thing is communication. Communication with your parents, communication with your coaches, your rep coaches, your physio. All of those people working together makes this so much easier. All right? So, like I said, I'll put together a set of resources, and Kieran's going to get everyone's emails. I think we've already got everyone's emails. If you haven't registered for tonight, do you want to take a picture of that QR code, and then we'll be able to get some details off you as well. And then we'll be able to connect everyone to the resources that we're going to put out. Cool. So can we get everyone up and we'll just have any last questions now? So, Rob, we might bring Rob up first. Has anyone got any medical questions for Rob? Oh, yes.
I appreciate that we're talking about fast bowling and stress fractures, but are there, I guess, any other kind of injuries for fast bowlers that we should
Know about?
be aware of?
Yeah, there's plenty. I'll touch on the main couple, okay? So in the ankle, we get posterior ankle impingement. And it's a pretty common thing, and you don't really see it in any other sports other than javelin throwing. So that's one to be aware of. In the lumbar spine, obviously, we've got the stress fractures that we're worried about. The other big one would be the thrower's shoulder. So that's quite often what we call a posterior impingement of the shoulder. And you don't really, you see the rotator cuff issues as well, but this is like an infraspinatus or a posterior labral tear. And that's one of the other really common ones we see. So they're probably the 3 big ones, would you say, Rob?
Yeah, I think that's right. And obviously I said, you're much safer wicket keeping, but all those wicket keepers with bent fingers won't agree with me. So fielding, you get dislocation, and lots of fingers and thumbs, potentially. But I think the throwing is really important, and I think that's another thing that conditioning is important. And I know, Simon, you're interested in unloading bowling and getting some throwing, but you also need to do the throwing conditioning as well, which is part of what Greg's talked about. So, yep.
Well, with growth rates in kids, some kids grow 4 to 6 inches. How much does that make the back weaker? How much do I have on for that?
Oh, gee, we've got to be careful crossing Greg's thing here, but my advice always in Greg, and obviously in an elite situation, it's not the probably correct, but in general, I encourage young people who are still growing I should probably have 4 rules. You don't compete with your mates. So, your little wingers shouldn't be competing with the prop forwards in the gym and that sort of stuff. So that's rule number 1, no competing. Your repetitions should always be at least 10. And if you're doing sets, you should have at least 10 repetitions in the set. You should never go to failure. And to reinforce Greg's point, you should have great technique, and probably that means having someone decent strength and conditioning coach to observe and correct. So they're the 4 rules: no competing, no failure, have a good coach, and have at least 10 repetitions in your sets. because as Amos went, your growth, your bone maturity is age 22, 23, probably a young woman it's 20, 21, but still the risk factors are in the sort of sub-20 age group. Yep.
Yes, go.
Is extension the only movement that we're concerned with when it comes to fast bowling? There's lateral.
Yeah, the lateral flexion.
Lateral flexion.
Yep.
Is that a problem?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. So when that lateral bending is excessive, that's definitely a problem. That's been come through in a number of different studies.
Even if the spine's in alignment, if the flexing laterally causes stresses we don't want?
Well, the thing is once you start flexing, your spine's not staying straight anymore. So if you look at those images, even those images I showed you, where they didn't have excessive lateral bending, those spines were not straight anymore. So there was definitely some sort of compression on one side.
And sort of that's why your fractures are on virtually all the time on one side, because you're not only extending but you're going into side flexion to compress that opposite side to your bowling arm. So it's really important. Yep.
All right. Thank you very much for coming tonight. And if you want to come and meet the presenters, feel free to come up the front. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming along. Cheers.